This week is aggregate demand, aggregate supply and economic growth, and in this video we're going to focus on aggregate demand. So by the end you should understand what the components are of aggregate demand, what are the things that lead to a growth in aggregate demand, what we mean by short-term economic growth, and what do we mean by the economic cycle. So let's start by just remembering something we talked about last week, which is that formula for aggregate demand. And if you remember, aggregate demand is made up of consumer spending, represented by the C, investment spending by businesses, I, government spending, and exports minus imports, the balance of trade. And it's these things that come together to make aggregate demand. But let's not forget either that when we talk about aggregate demand, we're also thinking about GDP, national income and national output. Because in this short introductory module, we can think of all of these things as being more or less the same. So when we talk about aggregate demand, it's more or less the same as GDP, more or less the same as national income, national output. We're going to use those terms interchangeably. So I want to start by looking at some real data, and this is some data about contributions made to GDP growth in the UK by those different components of aggregate demand. So we're talking about GDP here, and we're talking about the components of aggregate demand, because remember, GDP, aggregate demand, more or less the same thing. So what we can see here first of all is this blue line, which shows us GDP growth, the percentage of GDP growth in the UK over the last 5 years. And you can see that in 2015, GDP growth in the UK was about 2.5%, pretty low. But what happened after that was it went even lower, below 2%. It stayed there for a while, went down again a bit more to just over 1%. And that's where we currently are. So GDP growth in the UK, like many developed economies, is pretty slow now. But where does it come from? Where does that GDP growth come from? Well, we can see that the biggest component of GDP growth most of the time is this green component, which is household consumption or consumer spending. That's the C of aggregate demand. Another significant component is this blue, and this is gross capital formation, which is business investment, or the I of aggregate demand, and that's making quite a significant contribution. We also have government spending, which is this yellowy mustard colour, and we can see how that has made quite a small contribution to economic growth, although in the last year almost 1% of our economic growth came from government spending. One of the interesting things in this graph is net trade. That shows us the difference between our exports and imports and what contribution that makes to aggregate demand or GDP growth. And what we see here is that actually the contribution made by net trade is negative. It's below zero. So in 2015, net trade was actually causing our economy in the UK to get smaller, and that's because in the UK we tend to import more than we export. Therefore our trade balance is negative. We have a trade deficit, and that's what causes that to go below zero. It's making a net minus figure into our GDP growth. It's not always the way. Net trade made a slightly positive contribution there, but we're back down into the minuses there. So this next graph shows us something very similar, but it's over a long period of time, and what I just want to look at here is some trends. So the first trend I want to pick out is that GDP, represented by this black line, see how it goes up and down all the time? It's not a straight line. So GDP growth tends to do this in every country. It dips, then it rises, then it falls, then it rises, and so on. We get this cycle in all economies. The other trend I want to pick out again is the big contribution in the UK economy that's made by consumer spending. That's its blue colour. And a fairly significant contribution made by investment spending from businesses. That's the dark grey. We have government spending here in the lighter colour blue, which is always a feature. But what is quite weak in the UK again is net trade, that difference between exports and imports, which is often below the zero. So those are some of the trends in the UK. And there's another trend here which tells us something about the level of economic growth within the UK. And this takes us back much further. And I just wanted to make the point here really that when economies become very developed, the rate of their economic growth tends to slow. And we can see that here in the UK, that we have the average economic growth here in the 1970s, and when we get to the 1990s, the average economic growth has fallen a bit, and by the 2000s it's fallen again, and this is quite common. We do have some outliers here, some outlying pieces of data. See where we have these big dips. This line here is zero growth. Anything that goes below that line is when our economy is getting smaller. So the bars that are heading upwards shows economic growth. The lines that are heading downwards show us economic contraction. And this big contraction here was caused by the financial crisis in 2008. So that's the UK economy. If we look at the Chinese economy, and I'm just going to show you this one graph about the Chinese economy, just to show something different really, a contrast. So we saw that in the UK economy, the biggest part of our economic growth came from consumer spending or household consumption. That is not the case in China. Household consumption, represented by this light blue line, has been falling as a percentage of GDP. And the most significant contributor to GDP in recent years in China has been investment spending by businesses, and a big part of that is funded by savings from Chinese families and households. So in China, households tend to save a lot of their money. That's not the case in the UK. We like to spend our money. So in China, households save money, and the banks often use that money to lend to businesses, and that allows businesses to make big investments. And it's those big investments by businesses that have led to the massive economic growth that we've seen in China over the past few decades. So I want to fast forward now to where we are now, and this is not the most cheerful picture, but it's important to understand that this current impact of COVID-19 on the components of aggregate demand, because it really helps us to understand what happens in economies, I think. So again, we're going to take those individual components of aggregate demand: consumer spending, investment, government spending, and net trade. And if we look at consumption, we know that with the impact of COVID-19, consumption, consumer spending has fallen quite dramatically in most countries. Why is that? Well, it's partly because things like bars and cafes and hairdressers are closed. We can't go to them and spend our money. It's partly because we can't travel around, and so we can't spend our money on hotels and so on. But it's also partly because we're worried about the future. And if I'm worried about the future, maybe I'm worried that I might lose my job, maybe the number of hours I'm working has already reduced, well, that will stop me spending, won't it, if I'm concerned about the future. So consumer spending is likely to fall, and has already fallen dramatically in many countries. And then business investment. Businesses are also very worried about the future. Investment spending by businesses depends on them feeling confident about the future. If I have a business and I'm thinking of investing a lot of money in it, I want to feel confident that I can make a profit in the future to pay that investment back. Well, with COVID-19, we live with great uncertainty, and so businesses have been putting off investment spending, and so investment spending has gone down in many countries. The part of aggregate demand that has increased is government spending. In nearly all countries, governments are spending a huge amount of money. In the UK, it's billions on things like welfare payments, on supporting businesses, on healthcare, on all kinds of things to try to keep the economy going and to try to look after their citizens. And it's not just in the UK, that's happening in many countries across the world. And that's just as well because the other part of aggregate demand, net trade, is also in trouble during COVID-19 because there have been disruptions to supply chains, there have been borders closed, so it's just become more difficult to import and export goods. But also the markets for all of our exports have shrunk because, as we said earlier, people and businesses are very cautious, very concerned about spending. So we have this situation with COVID-19 where the C of aggregate demand is falling, the I of aggregate demand is falling, the net trade is falling, and the only thing that's going up and keeping economies afloat in many cases is that increase in government expenditure. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how we can illustrate this on a demand diagram. And you will think that this looks very familiar because it does. It looks very similar to the classic demand diagram that we saw in microeconomics. But in macroeconomics, we're not talking about demand now. We're talking about aggregate demand, total demand in the whole economy. And therefore, on the vertical axis, instead of price, we have the general price level, the price level throughout the economy. And on the horizontal axis, instead of quantity demanded of an individual good, we have the GDP of the whole economy, or we might call that national output or national income or aggregate demand. Any of those things are fine. And what we see is that if there's a general rise in prices across the economy, then we're likely to get a contraction of aggregate demand. So we see here when the price is high at general price level 2, aggregate demand is quite low at Y2. If the price level falls dramatically to general price level 3, then aggregate demand is likely to increase. And to some extent, that's been the story of the last 20 years or so. As the cost of manufacturing goods has come right down and the rise of Asian countries, particularly China, in manufacturing low-cost goods, the price of many goods has fallen, and that has increased aggregate demand in many countries as a result. So that's our standard aggregate demand diagram. But what happens when there are changes in aggregate demand? Well, the aggregate demand curve shifts, just like we saw in microeconomics. So if something changes other than price, so for example, if in a country everyone gets increased incomes, perhaps the government decides to raise the national minimum wage, everyone will be richer, everyone will spend more money, consumer spending will increase, and the whole aggregate demand curve is likely to shift to the right, if nothing else changes. On the other hand, when we get a shock to the system like COVID-19, and we've seen how consumer spending and investment spending and net exports are all likely to fall, that is likely to cause a shift in aggregate demand to the left. Less is demanded at every price. So, some of the things that cause those shifts in aggregate demand, and these are mostly opposites of one another. So if there's a fall in net exports, in other words, and that might be caused, for example, by an increase in the value of our currency. So if the pound becomes stronger against other countries, that means it's cheaper for me to buy imports from other countries, so imports will rise. But it also means that exports from the UK will be more expensive for other people to buy, and they're likely to fall. So that's likely to cause a fall in aggregate demand. But we can look at that the other way around. If the value of the pound went down, then it becomes more expensive for me to buy imports, and it becomes cheaper for people in other countries to buy UK exports. And then we've got things like government spending, and where do they get their money from, those governments? They get it from taxes. So if governments spend less, we're likely to get a fall in aggregate demand. If governments put taxes up, we're likely to get a fall in aggregate demand because people will have less money to spend. On the other hand, if governments decide to cut taxes or increase spending, then we're likely to get an increase in aggregate demand. Things like interest rates. An interest rate is the cost of borrowing money. If it becomes more expensive for me to borrow money, maybe I won't buy that new car. Maybe consumer spending will fall as a result. Maybe the business won't borrow money to invest in new machinery, and so business investment spending will fall. And then there's that thing we talked about, confidence. Confidence. If we feel confident about the future, we're likely to spend more. If we don't feel confident, we're likely to spend less. So these are the kinds of things which will cause changes in aggregate demand. And of course, what we've seen already is that when we get a change in aggregate demand, we get this business cycle of aggregate demand going up and down. So we have two lines here. The straight black line is just the trend of growth. And we can see happily in this economy, the trend is upwards. The economy is gradually growing. But the economy doesn't grow at a steady rate or in a straight line. Every economy tends to do this cycle where the economy gradually expands until it reaches a peak, and then the economy begins to contract until it reaches this trough or recession at the bottom, and then the cycle starts again with expansion, peak, contraction and trough. All economies go through that cycle. Sometimes that cycle happens very quickly and very dramatically, other times it's much more gentle and slow, but every economy goes through that cycle. Okay, we're going to finish there. There are a few questions for you to answer now.